So tonight we are proud to present our panel discussion, Representation in Photography, Subjectivity, Collaboration, and Ethics, with three prominent and leading Canadian artists, Michèle Pearson Clarke, Laurence Butet-Roch, and Shellie Zhang. So thank you, ladies, for being with us. Before we start, there's a couple of things I wanted to mention in terms of the technical side of things. So as Robin mentioned, everybody should be muted, and we're going to keep everybody's cameras off just to make sure that our panel has no distractions. There's a lot of people on here, so please make sure, if you want, put it on speaker view so that you don't have like 150 little boxes on your screen. We'll also be recording this lecture, so when we do the Q&A at the end, and we unmute you and you can turn your video on, but if you don't want to be recorded, feel free to not turn your video on. We will be in discussion for about 30 minutes, which will be followed up with a question and answer period. So everybody will be able to raise their hand. If you click the participants box at the bottom, you can raise your hand and Robin will unmute you so that you can ask your question to our panelists. After the panel discussion concludes, we will be celebrating the launch of Maximum Exposure with live musical performances from 8:30 to 11. So I will post the link in the chat box so that you can go to the Maximum Exposure website, and you'll find the links on there to watch our musical performances. So I'm now going to introduce our lovely panel. Michèle Pearson Clarke is a Trinidad-born artist who works in photography, film, video, and installation. Her work explores the personal and political possibilities afforded by considering experiences of emotions related to longing and loss. Laurence Butet-Roch is a freelance photographer and writer who examines how place and memory shape identity and politics. Laurence is pursuing a PhD in environmental studies at York, where she analyzes the discourses advanced by the visual narratives associated with environmental contamination and systemic environmental racism in Canada. Shellie Zhang is a multidisciplinary artist based in Toronto, Canada, interested in exploring how integration, diversity, and assimilation are implemented and negotiated, how this relates to lived experiences, how culture is learned, relearned, and sustained, and how things are remembered and preserved. So from here, we're going to start with our first intro question. Given the overall focus of this panel, representation in photography, subjectivity, collaboration, and ethics, can each of you speak to these ideas in relation to your practice? So I'm not sure if we want to start with one person in particular, or if we start with Michèle.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. Of those terms, I would say representation is the most significant for me. In my work, I think a lot about what it is to put an image into the world, and thinking about the history of representation of the communities that I'm interested in speaking about, speaking nearby, speaking along with. We know that photography has a problematic history, and so connected to that really for me is the ethics of how I work. So I think once you understand the representation of the communities that you are interested in photographing, then the ethics kind of really go hand in hand with that. So I think not just about the ethics of how I treat people or how I work with people or whether I should make a certain image or not, but I also think about the ethics of representation. You know, what does it mean to put a particular image out into the world for a particular audience in a particular venue? And then I'll just touch on subjectivity as well. It's one of those things that I think it's sort of easily apparent for people. Like if somebody who identifies, let's say as a feminist, is making a feminist project, it's very apparent that the person's subjectivity is part of shaping the work. But I think we get taught, and there's this kind of myth that there's an objectivity in photography, and I don't really believe that. Like I believe that subjectivity is present and relevant no matter who you are and what type of work you're making. And so, you know, subjectivity is not just about like your identity categories or your lived experience. There's also a visual subjectivity, and your visual subjectivity is shaped by every image you've ever been shown, you know? So depending on what culture you grew up in, depending, you know, what you travel, depending on what sources you seek out, you're gonna see different types of image making that's gonna shape your visual subjectivity, which is naturally gonna shape the types of images that you make. So I think about that a lot too, because obviously it's like I'm raised in Western culture. And so how do I do research and how do I seek out other types of images so that my visual subjectivity is broader and encompasses more possibilities for myself as well.
Great, thank you.
Happy to go next.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So firstly, congratulations everyone. I'm really excited to check out the website. Amazing that it crashed. My name is Shellie and I use she, her pronouns, and I work somewhat in photography, but also quite a bit in sculpture, installation, and sort of multiple based work. And so just a little bit about my subjectivity. You know, I moved around a lot when I was a kid. I lived in various parts of China and the US before finally sort of settling down in Canada a little bit. And so I think a lot of my practice is really informed by this constant need to sort of adapt to shifting dynamics of language, customs, various habits, and of course all the other pressures to sort of assimilate and adapt within those confines. And so this has resulted in my practice being really interested in looking at coded languages of signs and visual cues, and often, you know, what is sort of more perhaps beneath the meaning of those sort of sign and visual cues. And I think art affords a really great platform to have a little more patience to look at those notions a little bit. In terms of sort of subject matter, my work looks a lot at sort of deconstructing notions of multiculturalism, femininity, and Chineseness through a method of both researching but also listening. And so collaboration is really sort of central to my work. I can't work in a silo, and you know, every relationship that I've had artistically and personally is a form of collaboration, whether it's, you know, small talk over coffee or something more formalized. And so you know, there's the art, but then there's also the long length of collaboration and learning that sort of has to be there to sort of build up a process a little bit. So yeah.
Can I just respond to that? I love how you just talked about collaboration, because my interpretation of that is a kind of formal artistic way of like collaborating with another artist or collaborating, you know, with like a participant, the way some people set up how they describe how they work. And I love that more broader way of thinking about all the different relationships that are part of making what you do, you know, and that is just an ongoing process for sure. So, yeah, thanks for that.
Laurence, I can't see you, but I'm assuming you can hear me.
Am I here?
Yeah, there you are.
I see you. I can see you. You're actually central in my frame. So
oh no, it's not in mine. That's so funny.
Oh, that's very interesting. Okay, well, I am here. I've been listening, you know, all ears for what both of you have already shared. Also want to, you know, congratulate everyone for managing to finish the year and their project in these very kind of stressful times. And also say thank you for including me in this panel. It's such kind of an honor and humbling to be here. I really related to what Michèle was saying about subjectivity, especially given that I come from a practice that for most of its existence and still now barely acknowledges it. So I was trained as a documentary photographer. And when I left photo school, I very much had all of these very beautiful yet quite naive ideas about what documentary photography could accomplish for social change. And my journey over the past 10 years has essentially been constant fractures and like little like chipping away at those beliefs. So all those questions around, you know, ethics, around collaboration, it's always evolving for me. And it's always something that pushes my practice a little bit further and further, and seeing how I can keep it related to documentary, but how I can start expanding the bounds of what documentary may look like. So involving a lot other materials within my work. I work a lot on environmental justice issues, which also involves Indigenous communities, of which I am not part. I was born in Montreal. I'm a settler French Quebecois person. And so thinking through how can I also implicate my communities within this work. And this is where I've looked to archives that really showcases certain elements of kind of the pride that, you know, the communities had, that essentially Canada had in its kind of industrial complex. And figuring out ways so that it's not necessarily just me looking at a community that I'm not part of, but also starting to explain the relationships that we have together, and the roles and responsibilities that we play within these realities today.
Thank you. Thanks, Laurence. So for our first discussion question, how do you negotiate the insider-outsider relationship in your work, and how do you approach representing the stories of others? Laurence, I know you just touched on that a little bit. And Shellie, I know that you like primarily work in still life, so you have a unique perspective. So yeah, I'm not sure who wants to go first in regards to like insider-outsider relationships.
I can go ahead. It flows with what I was just maybe mentioning. It's a really good question and a really hard one to answer, because I'm very wary of recipes, of saying like, this is how you can navigate these very complicated relationships and negotiate being part of, not being part of, being half in, half out. You know, I think sometimes, you know, as artists, even if we're from community, we may not be experiencing the full same realities as other members of the communities. And so there's no like real recipe, but that being said, for me, there has been a shift in how I think about insider or outsider. And for me, it deals with, you know, who am I accountable to? And early on when I started, as I mentioned, coming from a journalistic practice, it was, you know, I'm accountable to the audience. My work is to inform the public. However, the more I practice, the more I realize my accountability is to community, and to make sure that they feel, you know, seen the way that they want to be seen in the work that I do. And therefore that means bringing them in at a different level. So it's having those discussions before, during, like after, ongoing discussion also, because, you know, opinions and ideas and views and perspective change, and always engaging in that. So for me, it's been very much just making a lot more space for discussions that are sometimes, you know, very, very hard and awkward, and we'd rather not have them because it shows, you know, our blind spots and some of the ways that we've been raised. But they're really, really helpful in kind of slowly moving the work forward. And with that being said, I think slow is a key word there, in the sense that, you know, I'm very glad that some of the work that I've done, I didn't publish right away, because it would have been riddled with kind of representational mistakes. So also taking the time and not rushing through things has been very important in dealing with that relationship of insider-outsider.
So if you don't mind me asking, like in terms of that communication, because it sounds like your communication is like through the whole process, do you kind of just like check in at kind of every stage with whoever that you're communicating with?
Yeah, I mean, and it's not really even that regimented. I kind of check in regularly on things that are related to photography and things that are not related to photography. So now, you know, just going in and checking with the communities that I work with often and seeing how they're doing simply is also incredibly important. But when there is moments, when there's a moment like an exhibition, you know, it does mean going back to community and saying like, hey, do you have like thoughts about how we did this the last time, how we can improve, and so on.
Laurence, I really appreciated what you said about the fact that there's no recipe for this kind of engagement, because there aren't a set of rules that you can necessarily follow to make sure that your work is, you know, in keeping touch with this community, because the dynamics are different in every situation. Space is different, time and difference, things change. And so it is almost constantly just making sure that it's an open invitation for feedback consistently in a way. When I first saw this question, it actually made me think of this real teaching experience for myself a few years ago. This was kind of a big project that I first did when I graduated from school not too long ago, but essentially it was like a drawn out project about MSG. And so for this project, I ended up talking to an elder in the Chinese Toronto community who was really knowledgeable in terms of the culinary sector and the education sector. And so what he told me when I told him I was researching this subject matter was that, you know, this is such a stigmatized and racialized subject matter that there's a lot of spheres where this can't be tackled. And so what I was kind of interested about from this conversation is that, you know, he's talking about how he was never able to talk about this in his time, in his sector, because basically you could lose your reputation and your job to a certain extent. And so it really made me realize the privilege I have as being an artist, and being able to say certain things with a level of freedom, but also at the same time, like who I am accountable for. So much like what Michelle is saying, when you put something into the world and it's being disseminated, what are the repercussions of that being disseminated? And so what is the time and the space and the influence that sort of adds into all those factors? And so that actually shifted the research portion of that project quite a bit. And instead of doing a sort of engagement project with restaurants as I initially wanted to do, I went a totally different route and sort of tried to amplify a different kind of research with the space that I am able to take up. I mean, I think photography is it's such a platform where it's almost like representation is sometimes offered and bestowed as a gift, like photography is enough, right? And so I think there's this question, like, sure, sometimes the stories that need to be told are important, and that's no question about that. But I think it's on the photographer to ask themselves, why am I the right person to tell that story? And it's not an A to B relationship, like you have to necessarily belong to that community, but your relationship does have to play a factor in it because it's unignorable.
I would definitely agree with that. I mean, I'm not a person that believes that, you know, only Black folks should tell the stories of Black people, or only women should tell the stories of women. But I do think that this is connected back to, you know, this question of subjectivity. And I say to my students all the time, there's a lot of work. The first step to me is self-reflection and self-awareness to really understand your positionality. So if you are to judge where you are on an insider-outsider spectrum, you really need to understand where you're coming from. So yes, I'm Black, yes, I'm queer, yes, I'm from Trinidad. Like, so if I want to tell stories about Black queer Trinidadians, there's still a huge amount of ways that I'm an outsider to that community. I don't live in Trinidad anymore. You know, I have class privilege, you know, if I'm going into certain communities. So sometimes I think we think we're an insider when we're actually an outsider in more ways than we are an insider. And so that self-reflection and that understanding before you even start is like the first step. And this is not a recipe, this is just, but that to me is the first step. And then you get to Shellie's point. After that self-reflection and that work, it's like, well, not even before that, does this story need to be told? Because I also believe it's a Western notion that more knowledge, more documentation, more is somehow always morally right and good. And I don't think that more equals good. You know, not every story needs to be told. Not everything needs to be documented. Not everything needs to be shown. Some things can be ephemeral. Some things can be experiences that only certain people know about. Like that to me is totally a part of it. So A, is this a story that I want to tell? B, am I the person to tell this story? And then depending on, you know, where you sit on that inside or outside of spectrum, how much distance is there between me and this story, you know? So if I'm telling a Black Red Trinidadian story, yeah, there's a smaller gap than if I wanted to tell like a Vietnamese story. Then there's like a really big gap. So if you think about it that way, if the gap is this big, then there's a lot more work I have to do to tell that story than if the gap is smaller, right? So it is a spectrum. And I think what happens a lot of times when photographers or artists create projects that get backlash or you know, upset people or offensive is because people haven't done the work to try to close that gap. And you can never close it completely, but there are things you can do to that research, that work, that self-reflection, that slowing down, that taking time, that consulting community. It's all long and slow and people don't necessarily want to do it, right? But that's what it, to me, that's what it takes. That's what it takes to tell other people's stories. And I think when you work in documentary as I do, you have to live with this inherent tension that there's a power dynamic and documentary is problematic, but documentary is always also powerful, you know? And that as humans, we make sense of the world by telling stories, and people want to tell their stories and people want to be seen, and that is healing. So we have that, it's inherently there's that tension that we can't free ourselves of it. I think the strategies that we can learn and gain, or the strategies we can implement, is to mitigate that tension. But I think as artists, we have to accept that that tension is part of what we do as well.
Absolutely. And kind of, you know, adding a little bit to that, I think there's also a really interesting part, which is really thinking through which discourse our images are participating in, and which visual tropes or stereotypes we may or be reproducing inadvertently. You know, there is a history in all the areas of photography of certain canons, and knowing where these canons come from, knowing how these canons may inadvertently be perpetuating messages that we do not ascribe to. And so really taking the time to consider not just, you know, ourselves and where we come from and whether, you know, we come in with good intentions, but then also thinking through what are some of the images, and am I actually playing into a discourse that I'm not really, that I don't agree with. I had instances of that throughout my work where I was realizing that, wow, I've seen this image, I've taken an image that I've seen so many times. And therefore, is this, you know, changing kind of like the dynamic? Am I really telling the stories that I want to tell? And maybe I need to revisit some of that imagery and start thinking along other planes. And I think it also plays into what you were saying about like the Western way of seeing things.
A visual subjectivity. We don't realize that, like, you know, we've all been exposed to 150 years of problematic images. You know what I mean? So even I, as a Black artist documenting Black people, I have to do that work as well, because I've been exposed to 150 years of racist, problematic imageries. You know, photography has taught me as a Black person how to see Black people, you know? And so that is part of the unpacking and the working through and the working against. That's part of what I do, you know. And I know what it is to walk into a gallery and see a photograph of a Black person that doesn't seem true to me, doesn't seem right to me, doesn't seem like any Black person I know in my life. And I know the opposite experience as well, right? It's like you see a photograph and you're like, right, that is life, that is a person, that is an experience that seems, you know, and I use that word true, you know, loosely, right? I'm not interested in documentary's version of truth, but that history of representation is so connected to that work, and part of closing that gap, or part of working on that gap, I absolutely agree, Laurence, is doing that research to understand how has this story been visually represented to date, you know? Yeah.
In terms of the role of the artist, observer versus participant, can the creator be both, do you think? And how does it influence the outcome? So kind of going along the topic of insider, outsider, observer versus participant. Shellie, would you like to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was trying to wrap my head around this question a bit, and I think the photographer is always a participant. They might not always be a consistently visible participant, but their action before and during and after the photograph is still with them, right? It's either under their name or taken by them. It's disseminated by them into the world, and so I think with that comes that constant responsibility, right? Is to not just click and put it out there, but to think about, like Laurence said, this history of how photography has been used and has consistently been used, how it's often essentializing, how you have to do this own work. You kind of have to be both in a way consistently, and that dynamic, you know, changes sometimes as well. But I think it's just, for me personally, I think it's more healthy to open that dialogue and to see that these roles are not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, any word like observe or fly on the wall, I don't find those terms helpful. I find that they propagate this kind of myth, right? That the camera can be objective, or that you can be objective, and that this is how I saw it, this is the way it was, this is how I saw it. And I just don't think that's true. I think that we are active participants in constructing images. It's like, even if you're an event photographer and something is going on right in front of you, you're still making choices about what you're photographing and what you're not. There's still things that seem relevant to you because maybe they fit in with the image you've seen before, right? Maybe they fit into, what do we think is crisis? What do we think is conflict, right? Like, those things are shaped by our subjectivity. So when we see, for example, people expressing shock that Black people are dying at higher rates of coronavirus, all Black people are like, right? Like, this is not shock to us. Like, there's a different knowledge base. So if I want to document what is going on for Black communities around COVID, it's like, what might seem shocking to some people might, put their lens on a certain thing because it's seen as shocking to them, whereas I would be like, I wouldn't, right? So this sense that just observing and, I personally don't find that accurate or helpful in terms of thinking about what it is that we do.
Yeah. And I really think that every decision has to be intentional and has to be judged. And yes, that's a lot of work, but, thinking about current events right now, yesterday I had a conversation with a close friend of mine, and we were talking about how news stories pick the images that they use for the news stories that they use. And, again, similar to what Michelle is saying, the weeks leading up to before COVID blew up, how it has in its current state, all the images that I saw using of describing the symptom were of East Asian faces with masks on, right? And even now, when I see it, now it's become either the image of the virus itself or something that's sort of quote unquote removed from the politics of the body. But these are intentional choices. They give into this existing narrative, and as subtle as they might be, they can actually perpetuate quite a bit of harm into the world.
I would agree with what both of you have said. I think we need to acknowledge that photography is an encounter. It's an encounter between the photographer and the photograph. It's an encounter between, and then that encounter gets expended with the viewer. And as such, we're participants. We can't remove ourselves from that relationship that gets created, even if there's a camera, a device between ourselves and the person who's in front of the lens. And there's a negotiation that happens there. I love the show that was at the Ryerson Image Center, The Way She Looks, and how Sandrine Collard also pointed out some of the agency that some of, mostly the women, that were in the images brought to the table as well. I remember her talking about Malik Sidibe's work and how the women, decided what they were wearing. And often, there was a lot of significance into the patterns of their dresses. But yet we hail Malik Sidibe as this person who had this great understanding of like African, textile. But it's also the person who came, the sitter who came to have their portrait taken, that had, you know, that brought in so much of themselves too in certain of those situations. And so really understanding it as an encounter and as these kind of negotiation of agency of authorship, and complicating who is the person that made this photo.
In terms of personal relationships, in what ways do you feel that personal relationships with subjects inform the work? Michèle, if we could go to you.
I work right now, you know, most of the work that I've made, most of my projects have contained a mix. So I recruit usually publicly. One of the strategies that I use in terms of questions of ethics and subjectivity is I usually build a project website. And so that my first career was social work and psychology, and I really believe in informed consent. And I understand that I'm an artist now, I'm not a therapist, but definitely some of my old career shapes how I work as an artist. And so a website allows me to say, it allows me a lot of space to say who I am, what my motivations are, why I'm making the work, where it's going to show, what I'm asking of people. And I put that out through social media. And what happens is a mix of friends respond and people I don't know, because then other people share it. So it makes for an interesting dynamic because, you know, friends obviously already know me and trust me and believe in me and want to support me as part of friendship. But then also it's the friends who believe conceptually in what message or story or issue I'm trying to explore, and that's something that's important to them as well. So they see me as Michèle and they see me as an artist, whereas working with folks who only see me as an artist is sometimes more nerve-wracking. You know, it's like people's ideas and expectations of, you know, all my insecurities will come to the fore more because I'm like, this person is expecting me to know what I'm doing. Whereas with friends, you're like, you know, you feel a little bit more comfortable to be, you know. But I find I really enjoy that mix because I feel the personal relationships have a different impact on how I work and how those images turn out versus people who I don't have a personal relationships. And I find that tension and that mix ultimately makes the project more interesting because of it. I respond differently. You know, you can't help it, right? It's like you have all these intimacies present with friends that are not present with people that you don't know, you know, even if they're from the same community as you. So I try to be mindful of boundaries with friends. You know, I really try to think about what it means to be photographing or asking friends to be vulnerable because the power dynamic is different. So I think a lot about making sure that I try to, you know, have the same boundaries around my ethics and what I will do or won't do, you know. So I group my participants, like Laurence, I stay in communication with my participants. And one thing I want to say too is I really invite photographers, when you're making these types of personal projects or you're making projects where people are being vulnerable and really, you know, exposing themselves for your camera, what happens is your participant develops a relationship with you and they develop a relationship with the camera. But I've seen it happen where it's very stressful for some people 3 months later, 6 months later, 1 year later to walk into a gallery and see themselves on the wall and see other people looking at them. You don't think about what it is to be looked at if you haven't done this before. So part of working with friends, you know, particularly with friends, because they're so comfortable with me, you know, but I always have that conversation with folks and say, you know, before you finally commit, like I want you to imagine yourself walking into a gallery and seeing yourself on the wall and thinking about what that means. And so when my work goes on, if it's showing in another city, I will email my participants and say, just a heads up, you know, this work is going to be on view in this gallery in this city during these months, because vulnerability shifts as well. So, you know, when we're feeling good and solid in our lives, to be looked at or to be watched, we have more capacity for that, you know. But if I'm feeling depressed or things aren't going well in my life and I'm feeling more vulnerable in my life, then suddenly being looked at feels more exposing, you know. So it doesn't mean I'm not going to show the work, but I just try to give my participants a heads up that the work is going to be on view. People in this city, you may have friends, you may have acquaintances, particularly hard when, you know, you have exes or whatever who might see you in this project. So those are just some of the things that are relevant to me in terms of thinking about those dynamics.
Thank you. So we have one more question left. And after this, we're going to open it up for a question and answer period. So our last question is, what are your thoughts on taking risks and pushing boundaries when creating art? I know that's a very general question, but if we could start with you, Laurence.
Yeah, that question, I sat with it for a while because initially my immediate reaction was like, yes, risk and pushing boundaries are great. But then I wondered, okay, which boundaries are we pushing? And suddenly got really scared of, does that mean pushing the boundaries that community or that the participants or that your collaborators are putting? Mm-hmm. And that I think is very, it's very touchy. You know, it's not to say, you know, there is a right for anyone to refuse to have their image taken, to refuse to be represented in a certain way. It's something that's very difficult within kind of the documentary and especially the journalism world. I've seen it recently when there was the Wet'suwet'en solidarity blockade across the country, and hearing some colleagues of mine being very frustrated that they were being kept at bay from the blockades by the land defenders and not allowed to be like within their blockade to make images. And it really had me thinking in terms of, well, we allow you know, the powers that be, so whether it's industry, whether it's, you know, our politicians, or, you know, the authorities, in their cases, to define what are the bounds of how we can photograph them and when and where. But when it's in terms of communities, then it's kind of a free-for-all. I can go in, I can take the pictures that I need to take to tell the story. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, I don't know that it's great to push boundaries. So very be mindful, like when you think about taking risk or pushing boundaries, what it is, which side it is that you're thinking about. On the other hand, if it's pushing your boundaries or the rules that you've been told exist, then yes, you know, interrogate them and try to figure out where do they come from? Who put these in place and why are they put in place, and how do they act and how do they restrict us as well? So it's a very complicated question because it can be taken from so many different angles.
Yeah, similarly, I also sat with this question quite a bit and went back and forth based on what the definition of pushing boundary is. And, you know, I don't photograph people, and I have quite an interesting relationship with photographing people. But I think that where representation is employed, for me, autonomy must be given to those most affected. And so, and that, you know, not extends only to photography, but any kind of work that's sort of being done in relation, in the namesake of, say, equity or justice, for instance, is to take leadership from those most affected. I also think that, you know, representation is sort of depending on the goal of the project. So if it's, for instance, a journalistic piece and the project is to shed light on an encounter, for instance, representation is just one tool in a possible toolkit to support those sort of goals. You know, collaboration, making space, and listening I think are other forms to achieve that goal. Like sometimes maybe you don't need to tell the story, but you can pass the mic or something. And I think that, you know, those are other artistic means and possibly more genuine means to do that kind of work.
And the only thing I'll add to that is I think in general in our culture, we sort of, there's a value attached to taking risks and pushing boundaries, you know, and I think it's very much connected to privilege. I think how much risk you can take and what boundaries you can push is really connected to how much privilege you have to, you know, buffer consequences, avoid consequences. But it's also relevant for me in terms of thinking about being aware of my own privileges, and taking certain risks, leveraging my privilege to push certain, like let's say working with institutions, it's something I do all of the time, you know. It's pushing boundaries around institutions' ideas and expectations of what Black artists, what our work is about, what we're capable of, what we need, what we want, what we expect, what we deserve. So pushing boundaries around that, because I have a certain amount of privilege where, you know, I don't want a younger Black artist to have to deal with this. So I will leverage the comfort I have in my life and my class privilege to push certain boundaries, to try to as I said, to leverage my privilege and to take certain risks. So I think it's definitely relevant in terms of who pays the price, who bears the cost of what risk we're taking and what boundary we're pushing. And so it's connected to the ethics again, right? Like ethics is at the heart. Like if any of my students are in on this panel, they'll know every week it's like ethics, ethics, ethics. The entire course is basically how do we build a framework of ethics for what it is that we're doing.
And that topic, like that's why we wanted to have this panel discussion on that topic, is because our fourth year students, it's what we've been discussing all year. And I think it's very important. So thank you for touching upon that. Okay, so we will now open up questions to the audience. On your Zoom menu at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a participants button. There you have the option to raise your hands. Or you raise your hand. Those with hands raised will be unmuted and called upon to ask their question. If you want to, you can turn on your camera. We are recording this again, just so you know. You can also paste your question into the chat window and I can read it to the panel. So I'm going to just have Robin come on to help me with that.
I'm here. So I'll just start going through where I see raised hands. I'll call your name so you actually know that I've unmuted you. And yeah, if you're happy to turn on your video, I think it's obviously useful for everyone to see your face. But of course, if you don't want to turn it on or be recorded, then that's fine as well. So I'm first going to unmute Sarah Angelucci, who's at the top of my list here. So Sarah, you are now unmuted and you can turn on your video if you want and ask your question.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
First of all, I want to congratulate hi, everybody. I want to congratulate the fourth year class who I had the great honor of working with for part of the year, and very proud of them. I know this isn't the opening they would have wanted, but I think this is an amazing occasion, and congratulations. The question I have for the panel is,
Did she? Sarah, sorry, you cut out. You might have a bad connection.
Real cliffhanger.
Okay, Sarah, we're going to come back to you when you
Maybe you can type a question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Sarah, why don't you type your question in the chat if you can still hear us. And in the meantime, does anyone else want to raise their hand for a question? I don't see any hands raised. In the meantime, actually, I'll ask a question?
Sure.
I actually have a question for Shellie. Shellie, I follow you on Instagram, and one of the things I really appreciate about your posts are that you often you kind of post sort of where you see signs and symbols being used in ways that, like you talked about these images of kind of Asian people with masks, and those are the images we see often. And signs and symbols that are used in kind of offensive and like insidious ways. And I remember one of the most recent posts was the images that the CDC was using. You had posted about that. I'm curious, because you work so closely with kind of iconic symbolism and signs, if you feel that you've like honed a language and you pick up on these things more readily the more you work with these types of images, because I do feel a lot of the things are things that people might be totally desensitized to. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly when you post it, it's like, oh yeah, that's completely offensive. I'm curious if you feel over time you've kind of honed your ability to sort of spot these sort of the ways that like signs and symbols can be used in kind of propagandist ways and used in sort of like subtle, insidious ways.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So for those who don't know, basically the Center for Disease Control in the US has been posting large messages on their Instagram in relation to COVID-19. And so recently they've posted a guide on how to be careful with the food that you eat. And so that photo was a photo of Chinese takeout. And then even more recently, they posted a photo. This is the Center for Disease Control. They post material in relation to science and health. And so they posted a photo of a Chinese brocade silk pattern. It's very similar to ones I've seen at the Met before, so it might have been taken from a public domain site. But it's basically a fabric pattern featuring a lion and certain bats. And so they used this as a means to try to warn people about how the virus is spreading. And so, not too long ago, I had someone ask me why I work with motifs, and particular ones that are, almost overtly ornamental and overtly Chinese in their expression. And so this is kind of a perfect example of that. These motifs, these visual cues, they're all in relation to bodies, and they're all in relation to people. And so I can't detract myself as an individual from these motifs because of the socio-cultural implications of how they exist in the sphere, right? Like when we see that image disseminated with that message, there is an insidious and often harmful intent to sort of do that work. And I think that's it's so subtle. You associate this with Chinese textiles, you associate that with the disease, and so that linkage forms quite easily, I think. But like I mentioned before, sometimes these unintentional actions have dire consequences. And kind of like the conversation we've been having with photographers' responsibilities, this also extends to sort of anyone who I think disseminates images, whether you're a photo editor, whether you're picking things for a magazine, whether you're designing a website. Those are all very intentional choices to sort of do that work. I don't know that I've gotten better at, say, spotting it out. I do think that perhaps just, coming from a bit of a personal experience where I've had to code switch all the time and sort of seeing how different things are read in different spaces has perhaps made me somewhat susceptible to it. But also, like I mentioned before, like these things are very much, the implications of how these images are circulated are very much on my body and my community's bodies. And so when something is that intangible, when aesthetics are that intangible to a person's being, it's hard to sort of separate the two, I suppose. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's
okay.
Great. Thank you. Sarah has now posted her question in the chat, so I'm going to ask, I'll say it out loud. Also, I just do want to remind students, you have 3 really wonderful people that can offer you advice right now if you want to ask any questions. But in the meantime, Sarah has said, I was taken by the care with which everyone took to talk about the idea of collaboration. Knowing that, for example, Shellie is in part of Amelia Amalia, do you think there is something inherently collaborative about feminist-based practices, or do you know where you gain ideas about your collaboration, whatever that means to you? So anyone can kind of address this question.
I wouldn't say that, I don't agree that it's necessarily, feminist is a loaded word, right? And I think, I don't think that there's something inherently collaborative in somebody who says my practice is feminist, but I do think there's something inherently collaborative if you have a feminist ethic of care. If your identity as a feminist, if your definition of how you move through the world as a feminist includes an ethic of care, then that you have a collective way of thinking about your practice, your organizing, your life, quite frankly, you know. And so collaboration, the way that Shellie talked about it, that was why I was so happy to just kind of have that added to how I think about what I do, because, you know, every day I'm in conversation with friends, colleagues, you know, about our lives, and because my work, particularly for me, my work is autoethnographic. So all of my work starts from my lived experience, you know, and so all of the processing, all of the conversation, all of the jokes, all of the memes, you know, that I share with everybody is all informing my practice all of the time, you know. And so that the feminist practice of citation, you know, I've been thinking about that a lot as well, in terms of thinking about in my work, how do I acknowledge, you know, more of the people who are part of making the work, you know. It starts so much further back before, like with my video work, I have a long list of crew, and that's very apparent, but there's so many other people who are part of you know, that collaborative process, the way that Shellie framed it for us, that is feeds my ideas, right? Feeds my ideas. And I'm a very theory-driven artist. And I always say to my students too, you know, I know theory is scary for a lot of people, but theory doesn't fall from the sky, right? So theory is a way of trying to give a language to something that we live, you know? And so that's, again, come back to subjectivity. You know, if you read theory by somebody who was, you know, living in France in, you know, the 1940s, and is male and is white, then their life experience is shaping their theory, and it may not resonate for you because their life is quite different. But when you get exposed to feminist theory or queer theory or critical race theory, the first time you read a concept that you're like, oh, right, I know what this is, and now I have a name for it, you know, and that language, that naming. So that collaboration too comes from all of the scholars, I think, too, that shape my ideas, you know.
Yeah, if I could just jump off that, I think it's, you know, sometimes on occasion I feel like the self-labeling of a feminist is almost slightly cringy to me, and I feel like that it's very easy to self-label, but it's harder to put an action to what feminist means, right? So if we think of feminist as a constant act of doing and re-evaluation and reassessing, it becomes activated as opposed to just sort of a self-descriptor and an adjective that just sort of stays there.
Thank you. Sarah, hopefully that answers your question. Does anyone else have a question? I don't see any raised hands on this.
I would like to ask a question.
Yes.
The other two. So I know for most artists, in interviews or conversations, studio visits, you tend to get asked the same questions. And I want to know from both of you, what is the thing that nobody ever asks you that you wish people asked you about your work?
Oh God. Let's think.
What are you desperate to tell us?
Is there not for you a part of your practice that you feel that people don't see or don't acknowledge or don't seem to think is relevant or important to you?
I think what's challenging, perhaps a little bit for me, is the many, many hats that I wear. And so people will either know me as a photographer because that's when they first encountered me, or they'll know me as a writer because that's perhaps how they've come to know me. Now that I'm more in an academic field, sometimes that's also what gets associated. And I also work in interactive storytelling, so some people think of me more as a new media person. You know, I teach at RTA in the new media program, and I suspect that most of my students have no idea that I'm a photographer. So finding
I have a guest joining us.
Oh, wonderful. So finding so being able to kind of bring all of these items to the table, and for people to know that my practice is informed by all of these activities that I do, that when I write about an artist, really comes and inspires then the work that I do, that understanding how interactivity online or how like new technologies are evolving, and also thinking about, you know, the culture and the ethics within that space, have come and informed my practice. How knowing what research ethics in academia and, you know, the ethics board approval, that has shaped my practice. But it's very hard because people know you as one thing and then you're put into that box, and the other ones fall to the wayside. So maybe like having questions around that would be nice.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of interesting in terms of a wish list. I feel like the opportunities that I'm asked to speak about and the, you know, projects that I'm asked to be a part of, and most of them I quite enjoy, but I'm always interested why people approach me for certain projects, right? And so what I get approached for a lot is projects that have to talk about diversity, representation, you know, femininity, and those kinds of things. And those are things that are relevant in my practice. So I'm very happy to talk about those things, particularly where it's environment like this, where I can learn from other people tackling those subjects. But, you know, once in a while, I would just like to be asked to just let me come to like talk about sculpture or formalism. Like my work is pretty formal. I want to talk about like formalism and just like floral motifs, you know, and stuff like that. Just something that is a different sort of is a different kind of labor to speak to, almost a little bit. So, you know, like I remember this amazing talk that Rebecca Belmore gave at OCAD, and she's like, you know, I wish my work was just taught in sculpture and installation and performance classes as is, and not necessarily in these sort of siloed courses that put her work in a bubble. And I really appreciated that, because there are a multitude of ways to approach different works. And I think this is kind of like what we were saying before in terms of like who gets to say what, and this almost essentialization that sort of happens a little bit, I think. But yeah, I think that's it. Let me talk about formalism maybe.
Thanks.
What about you, Michèle?
Yeah.
I think similar to Shellie, you know, like nobody, you know, what people should ask me about is my obsession with repetition and what that means for me formally and as a strategy, you know. And it's like, I understand that when people walk into the gallery, I mean, this happened, you know, I had a solo show at Gallery 44 called A Welcome Weight on My Body. And there were, you know, it was a maximalist show. There were 66 photographs in the main space and 4 large self-portraits in the smaller space. And that show was about me, you know, I'm 47. I went back to school at age 40. I didn't do a BFA. Most of my insecurities as an artist are around my technical abilities. You know, I'm very late to being an artist. I'm late in terms of our cultural notions of schedule and time and how your life unfurls. And so I wanted to sort of make myself vulnerable in that way, because vulnerability is one of the things I explore in my practice. But I also just wanted to kind of poke back at photography a little bit. I think there's a lot that we keep hidden, and some of what we keep hidden serves power and serves privilege, you know? And so that exhibition was about me learning how to shoot with the Hasselblad. And so those 66 photographs were a selection of the photographs I made as I was learning. So the show was about analog photography, like there were theoretical and conceptual things I was exploring with that. And it was about me learning and what does it mean to be on a different timeline than what our culture expects for an artist. But the review was all about how wonderful it was that I was taking up space in the gallery, and that there were all these, you know, that to see Black people in the gallery was pushing back against colonial notions. And not that that wasn't part of it, but that's not what that show was about. And that's not anything I talked about in the artist statement or anything like that, you know, but that's what the reviewer saw. And so I understand that. I understand that that is at the forefront for a lot of audiences and a lot of viewers. Yeah, I encourage people to think about, you know, approaching and thinking about women artists or queer artists or artists of color in terms of their conceptual approach or their technical strategies or their formalist approaches. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question from one of our fourth year students, Durga Raha. She is having technical issues, so she has texted me this question. It says, what are some of the challenges and or lessons you have encountered throughout your artistic journey? Do you have any advice for emerging artists in my graduating class?
Okay. I mean, I'm only about 10 years older than most of you out there, so it's still relatively fresh for me. I think one of the biggest things that I was so thankful for when I first graduated and, you know, began reaching out to people and researching is the incredible generosity that some people have. So I really encourage people to reach out to people you admire, people who you want to learn more about, people who you want to do, you know, an informal interview with, and, you know, do so with intention. Like, don't waste someone's time. Come prepared and sort of do that work in advance. But what I've been really thankful for is how kind and generous people are to share their stories and their knowledge, and to take the time to basically teach me a little bit, because you know, it's kind of nice to be able to receive that information, but then to sort of pass them on. And also I find that a lot of things that people shared with me are not things that are, you know, written down in books. So I can't get those stories of lived experiences from books published, right? I have to make the work and to reach out individually. And surprisingly, people are quite generous. And you know, sometimes if someone's an asshole, maybe you don't want to. There's been artists that I really admired in art school, and then I find out they're not the most generous person in the real world, and then that's a lesson in itself too. So really, just like, you're a part of the artistic community, and reach out to people, because they're your peers.
I would say one of the lessons is understanding that not everything is for you. You know, I think, again, there's this kind of this ladder that we're all expected to climb in a certain order, in terms of, like, you know, you get your first group show, and then you should want a solo show, and, you know, these things we should want, and the path that we should want, and that I think recognizing your limitations of your practice and how you approach, because I think sometimes we go after things that are not really for us. Like, not everybody's a public artist, you know, not everybody, like I have learned I don't do really well when I get invited to make a project in response to a particular theme or issue that I haven't been thinking about. The two times I've struggled the most in my practice so far, and even though I'm 47, my practice is not that old either, right? So I'm still an emerging artist in many ways. But the two times I've struggled the most have been in that situation where I sort of had to come up with an idea in response to something. And I was like, well, maybe I'm just not that kind of artist, you know, maybe that kind of situation is just not for me. And that means I have to say no to certain invitations because it's the best thing for me and my practice in the longer run, you know?
Yeah, I would echo that, as well as, I think, and I'm speaking candidly here, letting your guards down, especially when I started. I had set boundaries, which I think were to protect myself, where, you know, when you have the imposter syndrome, you have these very clear, you can be very kind of rigid in how you approach certain stories, certain project, because you're scared, essentially. And at least that was my experience. But it's when I let those go, when I let everything that I was living or learning, infiltrating my practice, and not being so married to the way that I was taught things or the way that I thought things should be done, that's when really things unraveled in a beautiful way for me. So, you know, checking that sometimes is also very important.
Okay,
And I'm loving all the cats that are.
You know how demanding they are. It's like, whoever does, just stay quiet. Just stay quiet.
If anyone listened to the CBC this morning, it was a woman talking about how when she tries to go to the washroom, her dog basically breaks down the door.
Oh my God.
People experiencing their animals just like desperate for them during COVID. It was very interesting. Okay, we have 2 more questions from students, and then we will wrap it up. So the first one I have is, it's in the chat here. It's from one of our master's students. She's in the Doc Media program, Aliya Yusuf. She said, I love this conversation. Thank you everyone for sharing your perspectives. I'm curious if there's an artist, writer, or theorist who really changed the way you think about representation or look at, conceptualize your own work. I'd love to know who inspires or has really shaped your practice in the context of this conversation.
Well, that's easy for me. I would say 2. I would say the artist, Dina Lawson, is an African-American artist, and my move into film and analog, as I was just talking about, has been shaped by what it feels like for me as an audience member, as a viewer, to look at images by other artists. And I noticed that there's something about film and the representation of Blackness that feels different. And very much connected to that is the theorist Tina Campt, who is most known for her book, Listening to Images. And she theorizes that, you know, images produce frequencies, so we don't just look at images, we listen to images. And so both of those have shaped my current thinking in my own theorizing based on that, in terms of thinking about if a digital image, surely a digital image, which is a smooth, clean thing, would produce different frequencies than an analog image, which is literally a gritty thing. And so there's something, when I look at a Dina Lawson photograph, she uses all the things that preoccupy me. She uses staging, you know, she uses narrative. Her photography is very conceptual. A lot of people think those are just portraits of people, you know, but she, you know, it's all constructed. She casts, you know, so all of those things, all of those tensions that interest me are present in that work. And then Tina Camp's ideas around what it means to feel an image, to listen to an image, and how what we feel, what we hear shapes and affects what we actually see in that image.
Great. Shellie or Laurence, is there any?
Yeah, I think like a really important artist I came across when I was in school that has sort of shown me a lot is the work of He-Chen Yao. She's a performance artist from China, and it's very interesting because I do not dabble in performance or video or durational works at all. But
not yet.
I don't think so. But I think she's the one that sort of honed a lot of these ideas for me altogether, and she's sort of radical in the way that she presents her work in a light that I've never seen. And quite frankly, I feel like she's someone that I really searched for in art school, but did not find necessarily in curriculum. And so I came to her work in a sort of different way. I think right now there's a book I'm reading that's kind of been really fantastic. It was recommended to me by my friend Lorraine, but it's actually a law book, and it's a law book by someone named Mari Matsuda. And so it's a compilation of like speeches that she gave to graduating law students as they were entering, actually this is probably quite relevant, as they were entering the world, and sort of talking about, you know, what their role as lawyers kind of are. But I found it's written 10 years ago, but I've actually found it quite incredibly grounding for right now in terms of talking about the politics happening right now. And it's been really helpful for sort of, there's such a demand to generate content right now as we're so image and digital heavy. And so looking back on this piece that was written 10 years ago has actually been really grounding, because it's sort of setting a foundation for where we can view where we are now, I think.
So for me, though, it can be, though her writing can be quite dense, this idea of the photograph as encounter, is something that I think Azule Ariella Azoulay speaks to very interestingly, as well as her understanding of photography as inherently collaborative, and collaboration on a spectrum from coerced to shared is something that I go back to a lot. And within that respect, I've always been quite influenced by the work of Wendy Awald, who is both a photographer and an arts educator, and has developed over the years many different projects that look very differently at how essentially communities can participate in kind of image making. She has a great project called American Alphabets that she did with different American communities, youth, where they design an alphabet. So they choose which word will represent each letter, and then how to visualize that word. And they create the whole images kind of all together as groups. And it's very telling and very interesting. And so she has developed different practices like that I've always found very interesting. And then in thinking about her work, there's also the writing of Pedri Spade, who writes about photography, like the potential of photography as a decolonial practice, and which functions photography as a decolonial practice can have. And that has been, it's something that I've been introduced to quite recently, and has really started to shift how I conceive of what my work may function as. It's maybe not about informing the public as it was years ago, but the work that it can do grounded within community.
Great, thank you.
Article. Yeah.
We have two more. We got another one squeezed in, another student. So we have two more. But Bryce wants to ask his question, so I'm going to unmute him. Bryce, you're unmuted, and he is
Hi,
here.
Bryce.
Hello.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the panel discussion. It's been really interesting. I just wanted to sort of preface the question with a couple things that were mentioned throughout the lecture that I maybe wanted to readdress. One being, I suppose the conversation's been really dominated with the topic of representing social communities, or communities that maybe we as artists aren't part of. So I wanted to sort of maybe look back into self-representation and discuss maybe some of the ethics of that. So Laurence, at the beginning, you sort of mentioned about what sort of visual language or sort of codified imagery we're producing and have subscribed to through this dissemination of images historically. So maybe considering that, and Michelle, you talked about sort of what stories should be told or what stories need to be told. And that got me thinking about what information we might disclose to others and what information the world should be privy to, especially when it's coming from our personal experiences. So I was thinking, to bring it back to the question of ethics, for a lot of young artists, they're looking to make projects about personal experience and about self-narrativizing and contributing to, again, sort of, as Azoulay would say, this economy of images. And I was wondering what maybe ideas or cautions you might have towards ethical concerns of maybe self-exploitation or transgressing one's own boundaries for the sake of producing work for an art industry that at a lot of times favors narrative or even historically exploits stories. Sorry for the open-ended question, but
So are you talking about self-portraiture or telling a story that is about your own experience or your community's experiences?
I suppose it would be more so to an individual or maybe an individual and their family in terms of self-representation. As far as form, I suppose it could take the form of self-portraiture or perhaps
sort of domestic what we call domestic ethnography, or what Michael Renoff gave us that term, domestic ethnography. I do think that, I think it's common that, it's like, yeah, most of my students are telling personal stories, and I think a lot of us who are motivated to tell personal stories are motivated to do so because we come from communities that have not been represented well, or have not been represented in a widespread way. So those stories are missing from a mainstream conversation or the mainstream outlets. And so we tell these stories because we ourselves want to be seen. We ourselves want our communities to be seen because we haven't been seen in those ways. And I think that, I mean, I don't mean to be jaded, but I'm not sure that showing your personal story in a white cube gallery, you know, we know what gallery audiences, we know the demographics of gallery audiences. Like these are just real facts, right? So I'm not sure necessarily that showing your personal trauma, you know, in a gallery is necessarily going to achieve what you may want to achieve from doing that, you know? I think there's times where people have made projects and not shown anybody, because I also think the process of representation, the first step of the process of representation to me is making the image. You know, the process of working with my participants and just me seeing them, that's the first step of representation. And sometimes that's the only step of representation, you know? I think that I do believe as artists, that is something that we have the privilege of doing. Just if the encounter doesn't go any further, that can be enough, you know? Yeah. I personally don't feel that every story needs to be told. I think it's something that is very seductive. There's something very seductive in that idea. And so, but at the same time, as I said, the tension exists in knowing that there is healing in telling your story. There is healing in sharing your story. And there's certainly healing when you think you're the only one who deals with something and you walk into a gallery and you're like, whoa, this artist is showing me this thing that I struggle with that I didn't know other people struggle with, you know? So I would think about issues of why are you making it? Who are you making it for? What objective you're trying to, you know, if just the making it can just be healing in and of itself. And if that's your number one goal, then you've met that goal, no matter what happens after that. If your goal is you want to change, you know, oppression, or you want to change, you know, how that story is seen, then dissemination and audience becomes really key in thinking about where do I show this project? Maybe it's not in a gallery. Maybe it's a photo essay, you know, in online, you know, or whatever. So I think thinking about the ethics of dissemination and audience is really key to why am I making, what's my objective here? What is it that I want people to think or feel or know, or myself to think or feel or know for making this work?
Yeah, I agree with Michelle. I think that, you know, there's so much focus on the individual artist and the capital A artist in the industry and their story. And it often gets, you know, conflated in a bit that's perhaps not the intention almost. You know, I've been approached to do work about my family, for instance, and in this way where they're shown in just physically shown, and that's not how I approach my work. And so even sort of these asks and what is the consent process, you know, my family's pretty private, and so I intentionally don't do that work. And a lot of my work is largely still life material, but I do have portraits of people. They're just not shown anywhere, and that's just for me, and that was good enough. And yeah, so what Michelle really said really resonated in terms of like, it's a totally, the making does not have to coexist with the showing. They can be separate processes independently, and that's your choice and your prerogative to how you want to put it out there.
Great, thank you. So we're gonna just do one more question. You've all been so very, very generous with your answers, and I imagine everyone's losing a little bit of steam at this point. So Tina, who is another one of our students and also one of the members of Converge, has asked here in the chat, I'm curious to hear more on what Michelle and Shellie have mentioned, how images representation imprints on the body and how their body imprint on their work. How does this alter image making? Are there types of representation? Are there types of representation or imageries that make you feel free?
What was the end of that question?
Are there types of representation or imageries that make you feel free?
I'm not sure what they mean exactly by images of representation imprinting on the body, but I guess what I would say to that is I feel like that, like what I talked about, that history of representation, like I almost think about like the 150 years of images that I've been shown. It's like a filter. Any of us, if we look at an image of a Black person now, today in 2020, we have to see that image through a filter of like all the images we've ever been shown, you know? And I know when I walk outside, like I walk outside of my house, I know that that filter also affects how people see me, right? So in that way, the representation that exists is imprinted on my body, right? So that no matter what I do, for some people, I am limited by what images have taught them to see when they look at a Black person, right? And we see that all of the time where, you know, like the image, the first example I show my students is the way the images from Katrina, where, you know, white people were residents who were finding food, and Black people were, you know, like looters who were robbing stores, right? And so that image, the way that that language is used is because that the image of a Black person as a criminal is automatically imprinted on those people's bodies, right? And so in that way, that's what I would say in terms of that question, in terms of how I see that. And so as somebody who makes autoethnographic work, then I have to think about how I'm not always in my work, but sometimes I am, and I'm working on my first self-portraiture project now. So I'm really thinking about what does it mean to put my body into representation in that way, and have a body that is not necessarily represented in a mainstream sort of discourse. And how do I include that in a way that, where's my boundaries around that, and what is it that I want to imprint on representation and using my body in that way?
Yeah, I think I don't have much to add to that, except that, you know, I experimented with taking photographs of people and showing those in a public sphere when I was first starting out and in my early practice. And I think what I found is that me doing that and me adding to this already mass grouping of images out there, it didn't necessarily add anything that wasn't already done or was better by anybody out there a little bit. And so what I wanted to do is almost add a bit of slowness when looking at things a little bit, which is why I transitioned to photographing things. And I actually consider the things that I photograph to be portraits because of the implications of those motifs on bodies. And so a lot of the things I select are through conversations with people, or through you know, how they were made or how they got there. And so there's almost like the journey of the thing in relation to the journey of the person that I think about a lot. And how does that enter like this, how do I find autonomy in image making in that way, through these affinities with these objects? What are images or imagery or images that make me feel free? I don't know. I love seeing people's selfies. I mean, just like on a broad sphere, it makes me really happy because, again, I'm only 10 years older than I think a lot of people in this conversation. And I think the multitude of multiplicities, you know, it wasn't so readily available even just 10 years ago. And I love seeing how the diverseness of how people are choosing to represent themselves for the camera, right? Like, I think that's so rich, and it's so easily accessible.
And I guess to me, I didn't answer that last, but I would say my bias, my love is what I would term, I guess, conceptual documentary. I love performative, staged documentary projects. I love the tension of looking at an image. You know, there's an openness of possibility there, you know, that I find makes me feel free in terms of the openness of possibilities available to me. You know, a traditional documentary image is a closed image. You know, it's telling us this thing happened, or we're looking at this person, or we're looking at this thing in a kind of definitive way. And stage conceptual documentary is asking us, what are we looking at? You know, what is the relationship with these people? Are they actors? Are they not? Like that openness of that possibility, that's what that's what I gravitate to, and that's what I find makes me feel free as a person in the world, but also makes me feel free as an artist in terms of possibilities for my own work.
Related to that, a lot of the work that makes me feel free, I say, are the artists that are working within the realm of futurism. This is somewhere where I'd love my mind to be able to go. But I find so much kind of solace and inspiration and kind of, you know, this ability to go beyond the scope of what our reality is and to imagine alternatives is so important, because that, like, prefiguring the world that we want to have is and understanding that the one that we have may not be the only possibility is kind of, for me, the first step towards a freedom. So that's the work that makes me feel free and hopeful, especially nowadays.
Great. Well, thank you so much. On behalf of Converge Lecture Series and Maximum Exposure, thank you so much for joining us for our virtual panel discussion. Thank you, Michelle, Laurence, and Shellie, for sharing your thoughts on representation in photography. It was so nice to meet you and chat with you. The MaxX website in the chat box. Excuse me, and you'll find the links to the musical performances there. The first one starts at 8:30, and they'll go until 11. So please join us as we celebrate the launch of Maximum Exposure, and we will see you there.
Thanks, everybody. Congrats.
Congratulations.